It had been years since I last saw Ryan, but when I got the message that he was in town and wanted to catch up, I didn't think twice before saying yes. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing myself, just a quick, "Sure, let's meet." At the time, it felt harmless. I hadn't thought about him in ages, at least not in any serious way. We had been together in our 20s before life took us in different directions. I got married, he moved across the country, and we both moved on. When I walked into the cafe that day, I didn't expect to feel anything. I was happy with my life, my husband, my routine, everything was settled. But when I saw Ryan sitting by the window, his familiar profile backlit by the soft afternoon light, something stirred inside me. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a little flutter, a recognition of something that used to be there. He looked up as I approached, and for a moment I saw the boy I used to know, the one who used to make me laugh until my stomach hurt, the one who used to know me better than anyone else. But we weren't kids anymore. I was a married woman now, and this was just coffee, just two old friends catching up. I reminded myself of that as I smiled and slid into the seat across from him. "Wow, it's really you," he said with a grin that hadn't changed. "You look great, Rachel." "You too," I replied, feeling a strange warmth settle over me. I told myself it was just nostalgia, just the comfort of familiarity. We fell into easy conversation, catching up on the basics: work, family, life. There were no awkward pauses, no tension at first, just the kind of relaxed flow you only have with someone who once knew you so well. But the more we talked, the more I noticed little things. The way he leaned in when I spoke, the way his eyes lingered on me just a second longer than they should have. And I wasn't innocent either. I laughed a little too easily at his jokes, let my gaze drop to his hands, remembering how they used to feel. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was just being paranoid, but the feeling was hard to ignore. Halfway through the conversation, he mentioned something about a trip he was taking soon, how he wished we could do something fun like we used to. It was a throwaway comment, something that could have been brushed off, but instead I found myself smiling and saying, "Yeah, those were good times." And then it hung there, between us. Those memories, those moments we used to share, the nights that felt endless and full of possibility. I hadn't thought about them in years, but now, sitting across from him, they rushed back, uninvited. We finished our coffee and kept talking, but the dynamic had shifted. The conversation became lighter, more playful, but there was an undercurrent to it that hadn't been there before. We both felt it, though neither of us said anything. My stomach tightened with a mix of nerves and excitement that I didn't want to acknowledge. I told myself it was nothing, that this was just old memories surfacing because I hadn't seen him in so long. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it. When we stood to leave, he suggested a walk. "Just around the block," he said, flashing that easy grin that used to make me weak. "For old time's sake." I hesitated for a moment, thinking of my husband waiting at home, but then I shrugged it off. It was just a walk, nothing more. What could possibly happen? We stepped outside, and the crisp autumn air hit me, making me feel more awake, more aware of everything. The sun was lower in the sky now, casting a warm golden light over the street. As we walked, the conversation drifted back into memories of our time together, how easy things had been back then, when the future felt wide open, and neither of us had responsibilities like mortgages or marriages. Ryan kept the conversation light, but I could feel a shift in the way he talked to me. More personal, like he was remembering who I was back then, not the woman I'd become. And I realized as we walked side by side that I was doing the same. In my mind, he wasn't just Ryan, the guy I used to date. He was the first man I had ever really loved, the one who, for a while, I thought I might spend the rest of my life with. We walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the kind of silence that feels familiar, like slipping into an old routine. But my thoughts weren't quiet. I was thinking about everything that had led me to this moment. My marriage to David was good, stable, comfortable, the kind of relationship built on years of trust and companionship. But standing next to Ryan, I was reminded of a different kind of connection, one that was more intense, more raw. It was dangerous to let myself think like that, but I couldn't help it. We reached a park, and Ryan gestured to a bench near the edge of a small pond. "Want to sit for a minute?" he asked, his tone casual, like this was just another part of catching up. I hesitated but nodded. We sat down, and as soon as we did, I felt it. That quiet tension again, the one that had been simmering just beneath the surface all afternoon. I folded my hands in my lap, trying to act normal, but my heart was racing. I could feel his eyes on me, and when I glanced over, he was watching me in a way that felt too familiar, too intimate. "You ever think about those days?" he asked suddenly, his voice soft but steady. I swallowed, unsure how to answer. I could lie, say no, tell him that those memories were buried under a mountain of new ones with David. But the truth was I had thought about them, not often, but sometimes, in quiet moments when life felt too predictable. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, and it wasn't the same playful grin from earlier. This smile was softer, more knowing. "Me too," he said, leaning back on the bench. "I always wondered what would have happened if we hadn't broken up." I felt my throat tighten. This was getting too close to dangerous territory. I could feel it pulling me in, and I didn't know how to stop it. "We both moved on," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "We're in different places now." "Yeah, we are," he agreed, but there was something in his tone, something that told me he wasn't as convinced as I was trying to be. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and looked at me with a seriousness I hadn't seen in him in years. "But don't you ever wonder?" I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. The truth was sitting heavy in my chest, and I didn't want to admit it, not to him, and especially not to myself. But the way he was looking at me, like he already knew the answer, made it impossible to avoid. "Ryan," I started, my voice shaking slightly. "This isn't—" I trailed off, unsure of what I was even trying to say. He didn't push, didn't try to close the physical gap between us. But emotionally, it felt like he was right there, waiting for me to open that door, just a crack, and I could feel how easy it would be, how one small step could lead to something I couldn't take back. "I know," he said softly, his voice full of something that sounded like regret. "I'm not trying to make this complicated, Rachel. I miss you. I miss what we had." My heart pounded in my chest, and I looked away, trying to find something to anchor myself to, something that would remind me of who I was now, of the life I had built. But all I could think about was how close Ryan was, how familiar and safe and dangerous it felt all at once. I wanted to say something, to tell him it was too late, that we couldn't go back, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I sat there in silence, feeling the weight of everything unsaid between us. The silence between us was deafening. I could feel the weight of his words lingering in the cool air around us, pressing against me, making it hard to think clearly. He missed me. He missed what we had. I wasn't prepared for that kind of honesty. Not here, not now, not after all this time. My mind flashed to David, my husband, the man who loved me, trusted me. I should have said something, should have shut this down the second it started to get complicated. But I hadn't. I looked down at my hands, twisting my wedding ring nervously. The band felt heavier than usual, a reminder of everything I stood to lose if I crossed this line. And yet here I was, sitting next to Ryan, my ex-boyfriend, a man I hadn't thought about seriously in years, and feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, a pull, a desire, a flicker of something I thought was gone. "I don't know what to say," I whispered, finally breaking the silence. I meant it. There was no easy way to respond, no safe way to navigate this without hurting someone. Either Ryan or David, or maybe even myself. Ryan let out a slow breath and leaned back, his eyes still on me, soft but intense. "You don't have to say anything, Rachel. I don't know. Seeing you again brought back a lot of memories, that's all. I'm not trying to make your life harder." But he was, whether he meant to or not. This was hard. My chest felt tight, and my thoughts were a tangled mess of what-ifs and possibilities I didn't want to face. I could sense the way this could spiral, how one wrong word or move could lead to a mistake I'd regret for the rest of my life. I turned toward him, trying to keep my voice steady. "Ryan, I'm married. I've moved on. We both have." I said it more for myself than for him, as if saying it out loud would make it easier to believe, easier to stick to. "I know," he said quietly, "and I'm not asking for anything. I just miss talking to you, miss being around you. I don't want to mess up what you have." But the thing was, he already had, not intentionally, but by being here, by reminding me of what we once were. He'd stirred something in me that I hadn't even realized was dormant, and that was dangerous. I felt the tension rise again, an invisible thread connecting us, pulling tighter with every second of silence. I stood up abruptly, needing to break that connection, needing space to breathe. "I should go," I said, my voice firmer than before. "It's getting late, and I need to get home." Ryan stood up too, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, you're right. I should head out too." For a moment we just stood there, not moving, not speaking, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us, and then, slowly Ryan stepped closer, closing the gap between us. I could feel the warmth of him, the familiar scent of his cologne, and my heart skipped a beat. He didn't touch me, but his presence was enough to send my pulse racing. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice full of something I didn't want to hear. I shook my head, stepping back. "Don't," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Please, don't." He stopped, his eyes searching mine, and I saw the conflict in him, the same conflict that was tearing me apart. He wanted to say something more, to push, but instead he just nodded, a sad, resigned smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to make this harder for you." I shook my head, blinking back the sudden sting of tears. "It's not your fault," I whispered. This just can't happen." He nodded, and for a moment, I thought he might say something else, something that would pull me back in. But instead, he just stepped back, giving me the space I so desperately needed. "Take care, Rachel." "You too," I said, my voice barely audible. I turned quickly, not trusting myself to linger any longer. I walked away without looking back, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind a mess of emotions I didn't know how to process. As I reached the end of the street, I paused for just a moment, my mind racing with everything that had just happened. I could feel the pull of temptation still lingering, the ache of something unfinished, but I forced myself to keep walking. By the time I reached my car, the reality of the situation hit me like a wave. I hadn't crossed the line, but I had come dangerously close, too close. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, my heart still racing. This wasn't me. This wasn't who I was. I loved David, and I needed to remind myself of that. Whatever this had been with Ryan, it was in the past. and that's where it needed to stay. I took a deep breath and started the car, forcing myself to focus on the road ahead, on my life, on my husband. But the feeling lingered, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind, reminding me of what almost happened, and I knew it wouldn't be easy to forget. Since you enjoyed this video, click on the subscribe button on the screen and check out our channel for more videos like this.